Explain like I'm 5. Why is fusion always 30 years away? It seems that for the last couple of decades, fusion has always been 30 years away, and by this point, we've well passed the initial 30, and seemingly little progress has been made. Is it just that it's so difficult to make efficient? Has the technology improved substantially, and we just don't hear about it often? You look at current progress and say, we've solved 1/3 of the problem in 10 years, so 1/3 every decade is 30 years. The problem, of course, is you've solved all the easy problems and the harder ones take longer. You have literally no idea how long it takes to solve each problem you know about, and you don't even know all the problems. Technological progress is hardly linear. For all we know, we can make some insane breakthrough and figure it out in 5 years. Or maybe it'll take another 100, or maybe never. The technology has improved substantially, but it's so extreme in terms of temperature and pressure. Essentially, you're trying to cage a bit of the sun, that finding a method to keep it contained that doesn't take more energy to hold it in place than it creates is ferociously difficult. And when you've succeeded at laboratory scale, you then have to make it up to production scale, and the problems amplify exponentially. In short, it's like climbing a lot of mountains. Just when you think you have reached the top, you find you've just reached a false summit, and the real one is further away. And when I was 50 years younger, it was 50 years away. So we have made some progress. Essentially, you're trying to capture a bit of the sun. It's more than that. In order for fusion to work on Earth, the temperature needs to be much higher than the core of the sun to make up for the amount of pressure. In addition, fusion happens much slower in the sun, where it wouldn't be economically viable on Earth. I've read that, by volume, the sun is outputting about as much energy as a compost pile. And the reason it's so powerful is that it's so massive. The biggest problem with fusion research is the overall lack of funding. The paltry amount of research funding for fusion was once described by a scientific journal as fusion never. There are tons of brilliant engineers and scientists with good ideas, willing and able to work on it, but there just isn't the money to build and run the test equipment required for every project. The big government funding throughout the 20th century was put against fission research because a byproduct of fission reactors is enriched uranium and plutonium used in nuclear weapons. So it was very politically motivated by the Cold War. As a result, fusion power research was entirely niche, and the few teams working on it make very limited progress. If we assume that there's a 98% chance that any particular fusion concept is actually a dead end, there are hundreds of potential design concepts, and we only have 3 projects on the go at any time. We make very little progress. Each experiment, though, teaches us more and more about fusion. So saying that we are making no progress would be incorrect. It's just very slow. There has been a significant uptick in research in the past 20 years because of the push towards green energy. But what politicians don't realize is that fusion is such a game changer that what we really need is a Manhattan Project for fusion. If you give the scientists effectively unlimited funding and have multiple teams working on it, we could probably figure out viable means of using it within a decade. The first country that figures out sustainable and practical fusion will have a huge economic and scientific advantage for decades and will make the investment worth it. Not to mention the benefits of cheap power that comes with it. In 1976, the U.S. Energy Research and Development Administration, ERDA, published a detailed fusion program plan 4, suggesting that if a sequence of advanced test facilities were constructed in a timely fashion, fusion electricity could be on the grid in a demonstration power plant by the year 2000. This plan was codified by Congress in the Magnetic Fusion Energy Engineering Act of 1980, signed by President Carter on October 7, 1980. The act was signed just as the U.S. energy crisis was coming to an end, as proclaimed by President Reagan upon taking office in January 1981. The provisions of the act were never implemented. Furthermore, fusion and other energy R&D programs experienced major funding reductions during the 1980s and 1990s. Historical Perspective on the United States Fusion Program. This is really fascinating. It seems like fusion power has been 30 years away for quite some time now, and it's amazing to hear the reasons behind it. The fact that capturing a bit of the sun requires extreme temperature and pressure, and that achieving a sustainable and practical fusion will have huge economic and scientific advantages is mind-blowing. The idea that the technology has improved substantially, but the challenges associated with containment and scalability make it so difficult to achieve, is truly eye-opening. I never realized the significant lack of funding and the political motivations that have hindered fusion research progress all these years. It's frustrating to think that with more funding and collaboration, we could be much closer to figuring out viable means of using fusion. The potential for cheap, sustainable energy and the economic advantages are simply game-changing. What exactly has been the most significant breakthrough in fusion research in recent years? And what can be done to increase awareness and funding for this crucial research? Let me know in the comments down below, and let's move right into our next Reddit post. Explain like I'm 5, why do relatively large bodies break down faster? There was a post in absolute units of a giant basketball player, Hamad Fathi, who is 7'2". And a lot of people were commenting about the likely sad state of his knees and back. My question is, if he is fully proportional and athletic with no extra weight damaging his joints, are the forces of gravity enough to do more damage to him just because of his exceptional size? What else could slowly wear away at someone that large's body? It's called the square cube law. Area scales by the square of width height, but volume scales by the cube of width height. Let's say you take a person and double their height while keeping their proportions the same. That person's muscles and bones will be 4 times as strong, because by doubling their height, you'll be multiplying the cross-sectional area of their muscles and bones by 4. But the problem is that they'll be 8 times as heavy because their weight is based on their volume. So you've got 8 times as much weight on joints, bones, and muscles that are only 4 times as strong. This doesn't just affect people. It's a basic engineering principle. It's why you can build a hut with some sticks, but you need steel beams to build a skyscraper. Both mechanical devices and biological bodies face problems when you try to scale them up or down. What about giraffes? They are tall and have skinny legs, small joints. What about elephants? They're big boys, and they don't have these problems. Or do they? My question is if he is fully proportional. See, there's the issue. A bone's strength is proportional to its cross-sectional area, which grows with size squared. Similarly, pressures on joints depend on the surface area of those interaction points, which scales with size squared. But weight scales with size cubed, and twisting forces scale with weight times the size, or proportional to size to the 4. So even if the body is proportional, the forces aren't. Because he is not fully proportional. I don't know the guy, but the mechanics of how your body moves change when you diverge from normal height and weight. In the case where you're taller, but not heavier, you're still putting more stress on your joints because the forces involved are still bigger. If you walk out onto a plank suspended over nothing, the further you get away from the ground it's attached to, the more likely the plank is to break, despite your weight not having changed. The stress on the joint is proportional to the distance to the force. That is to say that if your limbs and frame are longer, your center of mass will also be further away from the joints that move that weight, therefore increasing the stress they take. That kind of thing can build up over time for very tall people. If he's fully proportional, then he's getting hit by the square cube law, which means that the volume of his body parts increases much faster than surface area. It's bad because your needs are usually cubed, but your providing capability is only squared. That means that if you were suddenly 2x bigger, you'd weigh 8x as much, but your muscle cross-section would only be 4x as big, so now you're only relatively half as strong as you used to be. The same thing with body heat. You are 8x bigger, but you give off heat through the surface of your skin, which is only 4x bigger, so the disproportion strikes once again. The discussion on why relatively large bodies break down faster is fascinating. It's incredible how the square-cube law affects human and mechanical bodies. The concept of muscles and bones becoming 4 times as strong, but the weight increasing by 8 times is mind-boggling. It's essential to understand the impact of this law when scaling up or down. Even when a person is fully proportional, the forces on their body aren't, leading to increased stress on their joints. This could have significant implications for very tall individuals like Hamad Fathi, the giant basketball player. The disproportion in muscle strength, the surface area for heat dissipation, and the effects of gravity on his body are thought-provoking. Do you think advancements in technology and medicine could alleviate the physical strain on exceptionally tall individuals like Hamad Fathi? What other factors, aside from the square-cube law, do you think could contribute to the gradual wear and tear on their bodies? Let me know in the comments down below, and let's move right into our next Reddit post. Explain like I'm 5. Why did the US government bail out the banks in the financial crisis of 2008? Why didn't they just give the money directly to the people that were hurt? Don't bailouts just incentivize the mismanagement of customer funds? Instead of bailing out the institutions, why didn't the government just let them fail and give the money directly to the people hurt by the bank's mismanagement? Why were the banks protected? Doesn't this kind of protection incentivize banks to act recklessly in the future? The idea, whether it's correct or not, is not something I'm qualified to comment on, is that the bailout would be much cheaper than dealing with the fallout of the banks failing. So, like they either spent a ton of money to prop up the banks, or the banks fail and they have to spend a ton more money helping everyone that got screwed over. That said, when it comes to the bailouts, there's 2 reasons it's not supposed to incentivize the mismanagement of customer funds. First, one is that a number of new laws and regulations came out that made it illegal for banks to do a lot of the crap they did back then. And while banks are definitely out for themselves, they do tend to follow the law if the cost of not following it is too high. Second was that most of that bailout money was actually a loan, so they had to pay it back. Second was that most of that bailout money was actually a loan, so they had to pay it back. I blame politicians for so many people not understanding this. Far too often they bring up, we can bail out companies and banks but not give money directly to citizens. The big difference between bailouts and handouts is that they're paid back. The US didn't just give the banks money. The US loaned the banks the money they needed to stay operational and made a profit for US taxpayers by doing so. The world financial system was at risk. A global failure of banks would have done damage dwarfing the Great Recession. We bailed out the banks because we had to, not because they deserved it. Leverage. The amount of money people were owed by banks in trouble dwarfed the rescue by 2 orders of magnitude. Much more bang for the buck, and more chance of it working smoothly to keep the institutions alive. This is an interesting and complicated topic. The US government bailed out the banks in the financial crisis of 2008 because the collapse of the banks would have caused even more damage to the financial system and the economy as a whole. The bailout was seen as a necessary measure to prevent a complete meltdown of the global financial system. Plus, most of the bailout money was actually a loan, which means the banks had to pay it back. It wasn't just a handout, and there were new laws and regulations put in place to prevent the mismanagement of customer funds in the future. But why didn't the government just give the money directly to the people hurt by the bank's mismanagement? Why were the banks protected? Doesn't this kind of protection incentivize banks to act recklessly in the future? I'm really curious to understand more about this and the decision-making process behind the bailout. If the banks were at fault, why didn't they face the consequences rather than receiving help from the government? What are your thoughts on this? Well, that's another episode of Explain Like I'm 5 in the books. I really appreciate all of you who made it this far into the video. Of course, if you enjoyed this video, it would really help the channel out a lot if you gave the video a thumbs up, subscribe, or leave a comment down below. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.